In this video, we'll cover everything you need to know about economics, starting from the very definition, then moving into the core ideas like scarcity, opportunity cost, supply and demand, and how choices shape markets. If you've ever found economics confusing, this is for you. Stick with me until the end, and I promise these concepts will finally make sense, and you'll see how they apply to real life. Let's dive in. Economics is the study of how people, businesses, and societies make choices to use limited resources to satisfy unlimited wants. At its heart, the big idea is simple. Scarcity leads to choice, and every choice comes with an opportunity cost. Scarcity means that resources are limited. We don't have enough money, time, labor, or natural resources to satisfy everything we want. Think about your own life for a second. You only get 24 hours in a day. That's a scarce resource. You can't work, study, rest, and hang out with friends all at the same time, so you need to choose carefully how to use those hours. And that brings us to choice. Because resources are scarce, we are forced to make decisions, and this applies to everyone, individuals, businesses, even governments. A business might have to decide whether to spend money on marketing or improving its product. A government might have to choose between investing in healthcare or building new highways. Scarcity forces us to make choices every single day. But choices always come with a cost, and that cost is what economists call opportunity cost. Opportunity cost is simply the value of the next best alternative that you give up when you make a decision. For example, if you have $800, you could buy the newest smartphone, or you could use that money to pay rent. If you buy the phone, the opportunity cost is not being able to pay rent on time. Or think about your free time. If you choose to spend the evening watching movies, the opportunity cost might be the time you could have spent studying for an exam. Notice that opportunity cost is not always about money. It's about trade-offs in every decision we make. So let's pull it all together. Scarcity means resources are limited. Choice is the decisions we must make because of that scarcity. And opportunity cost is what we give up when we choose one option over another. This chain, scarcity, choice, and opportunity cost, is the foundation of economics. It explains why individuals, businesses, and governments all need to think carefully about how to use their resources. Up until now, we've looked at economics in pieces, but it's time to clear up one of the biggest beginner questions. What's the real difference between microeconomics and macroeconomics? Microeconomics is the study of small-scale, individual decisions. It zooms in on households, workers, and businesses, focusing on specific markets like coffee, housing, or labor. In simple terms, microeconomics looks at how individual people and firms make choices about what to buy, what to sell, and how much to produce. For example, why do coffee prices rise when the cost of milk goes up? How do firms decide how many workers to hire? What happens if a city raises its minimum wage? Microeconomics gives us the answers by examining the details of one market at a time. Think of it like looking through a microscope. Sharp focus on the small, specific interactions that drive everyday economic life. If Starbucks notices milk prices rising and decides to increase the price of coffee, that's a classic microeconomic decision in action. Now let's pull the lens back. Macroeconomics looks at the economy as a whole, either at a national or even global level. Instead of focusing on one household or one business, macroeconomics studies the big forces that affect everyone. It examines inflation, which is the general rise of prices over time, unemployment, which is the share of people who want a job but can't find one, and GDP, which measures the total value of all goods and services a country produces. It also looks at how government policies like taxes, interest rates, or stimulus programs shape the overall economy. For example, during a global recession, when the U.S. economy slows down, unemployment rises, GDP shrinks, and inflation shifts. That's macroeconomics at work. It's like zooming out with a telescope to see the big picture trends that impact millions of people at once. Here's the key takeaway. Microeconomics studies individual choices and markets, while macroeconomics studies the economy as a whole. They're different in scale, but deeply connected. Millions of small, everyday decisions, like how much coffee to buy, add up and create the larger macro picture. And in reverse, macro policies, such as lowering interest rates, influence the micro choices made by households and businesses. So, if you want to understand why your morning coffee suddenly got more expensive, you study microeconomics. But if you want to understand why the cost of living rises across the entire country, you study macroeconomics. That's the difference: microscope versus telescope, the details versus the big picture. Every economy, no matter how big or small, faces the same challenge: scarcity. Resources like land, labor, and capital are always limited, but human wants are unlimited. Because of this, societies everywhere must answer three basic economic questions, and these questions shape the way economies work. The first question is what to produce. Since resources are scarce, a society has to decide which goods and services will be made. For example, should land be used to grow food or to build housing? If a country focuses too much on one, it gives up the other, and that trade-off is called opportunity cost. The second question is how to produce. This is about choosing the method of production. Should goods be produced in a labor-intensive way, which uses more workers, or in a capital-intensive way, which relies more on machines and technology? The choice often depends on the resources available and the goals of the economy. The third question is for whom to produce. This is about distribution. Who will receive the goods and services that are produced? For example, if houses are built, will they be luxury apartments for wealthy families or affordable homes for low-income renters? The answer depends on how a society decides to share its limited output. Let's take a simple example of a housing shortage. The what is the decision to build more houses. The how could be either affordable mass construction or expensive luxury designs. And the for whom is whether those houses go to high-income buyers or to families who need low-cost housing. Every society faces these choices, and different systems, like capitalism or socialism, answer them in different ways. So let's recap. Economics is all about choices under scarcity, and every choice comes with an opportunity cost. Microeconomics looks at how individuals and businesses make these decisions, while macroeconomics looks at the economy as a whole. And at the heart of it all, every economy must answer the same three questions: what to produce, how to produce, and for whom to produce. We now shift our focus to microeconomics, which is one of the two main branches of economics, and it deals with the choices of individuals, households, and businesses, rather than the economy as a whole. Think of it as zooming in with a microscope to see how smaller decisions build the bigger economic picture. In this part of our course, we will explore supply and demand, elasticity, consumer behavior, production and costs, and market structures. For today, let's begin with one of the most important foundations of all: demand and the law of demand. Demand is defined as the relationship between the price of a good or service and the quantity that consumers are willing and able to purchase during a given period of time. In simple words, demand tells us how much people want something at different prices. The law of demand states that, holding all other things constant, when the price of a good increases, the quantity demanded decreases, and when the price decreases, the quantity demanded increases. Economists describe this as an inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. Why does this happen? There are two main reasons. First, the substitution effect. When the price of one good goes up, people tend to switch to cheaper alternatives. Second, the income effect. When prices rise, consumers feel like their income buys less, so they cut back. Let's make this practical. Imagine your favorite coffee shop suddenly raises the price of a latte from $4 to $7. Many students and office workers would start buying fewer lattes or switch to a regular brewed coffee instead. That's demand in action. Another everyday example is Uber surge pricing. When fares suddenly rise during busy rush hours, fewer people request rides, and some switch to public transport or wait until prices fall again. So to recap, demand shows us how price and quantity demanded are linked, and the law of demand reminds us that the link is always negative or downward sloping. As we continue through this section on microeconomics, We'll also look at the law of supply, how markets reach equilibrium, and why elasticity matters. But for now, remember this simple truth. When prices go up, demand goes down. And when prices go down, demand goes up, all else being equal. When we talk about supply in economics, what we really mean is the relationship between the price of a good and the quantity that producers are both willing and able to sell. The law of supply states that, all else being equal, as the price of a good rises, the quantity supplied will rise as well. And as the price falls, the quantity supplied will decrease. In simple terms, there's a direct relationship between price and supply. Higher prices encourage producers to make and sell more, while lower prices discourage production. Why does this happen? The answer comes down to profit incentive. Producers are motivated by the possibility of earning more revenue. If the selling price of a product increases, producing that product becomes more profitable, so suppliers shift more resources into making it. On the other hand, if the price drops, the reward isn't worth the effort or cost, and suppliers pull back. Let's make this clear with some examples. Imagine a wheat farmer. If the market price of wheat goes up, that farmer has a reason to plant more wheat next season because every bushel sold brings in more income. If the price drops, the farmer may cut back on planting or even switch to a different crop that's more profitable. Another example is Apple with its iPhones. When demand is high and customers are willing to pay premium prices, Apple increases production and releases more units into the market. If the price consumers are willing to pay falls, Apple won't keep producing at the same scale, because the profit margin would shrink. So the key takeaway is this. The law of supply shows us how producers respond to price changes. Price goes up, supply goes up. Price goes down, supply goes down. It's one of the fundamental building blocks of economics, and it explains a big part of how markets adjust and how resources get allocated over time. Now that we understand supply and demand separately, let's see what happens when they come together in the market. The point where supply and demand meet is called market equilibrium. At this point, the price and the quantity are balanced. Economists call the equilibrium price P star. That's the price at which the quantity demanded equals the quantity supplied. And the equilibrium quantity, Q star, is the amount of goods actually bought and sold at that price. Here's why this matters. If the price is set too high, suppliers are eager to sell, but buyers hold back. The result? A surplus, too much product sitting unsold. On the other hand, if the price is set too low, lots of people want to buy, but sellers can't keep up. That creates a shortage, not enough to satisfy demand. Markets don't like imbalances. Over time, prices naturally adjust toward equilibrium, because that's where buyers and sellers are both satisfied. Let's bring this to life with a real-world example. Imagine concert tickets. If tickets are priced way too high, the stadium will have empty seats, a surplus. If tickets are super cheap, they'll sell out in minutes, a shortage. The sweet spot is the equilibrium price, where just the right number of tickets are sold and the venue fills up without leaving fans locked out or seats empty. So the big takeaway is this. Equilibrium is the just right point where the market clears. No surplus, no shortage, just balance. Now that we've seen how supply and demand normally work, let's talk about what happens when the curves themselves shift. Remember, price changes move us along a curve, but real-world events can actually shift the entire curve left or right. Let's start with the demand curve. Demand represents consumers' willingness to buy. So what makes people demand more or less, besides the price itself? Non-price factors. Income is a big one. If people's incomes rise, they can afford more. Imagine incomes going up. Suddenly, more people can buy Starbucks coffee every day, so the demand curve shifts to the right. On the other hand, if incomes fall, demand shifts left. Preferences also matter. If healthy eating becomes trendy, more people will buy smoothies or salads. Demand for those products rises, shifting the curve right. If trends shift the other way, demand falls. Related goods play a huge role too. Think substitutes and complements. If the price of Pepsi goes up, many people switch to Coke, so Coke's demand rises. That's a substitute effect. For complements, think of gas and SUVs. If gas prices rise sharply, Fewer people want gas-guzzling SUVs. SUV demand shifts left. Now let's look at supply. Supply is about producers and how much they're willing to bring to market. Non-price factors here include technology, costs, and shocks. Technology often shifts supply to the right. Better farming technology, for example, makes it easier to grow more wheat, increasing supply. Input costs shift supply the other way. If coffee bean prices rise, Starbucks faces higher costs, so their supply of lattes decreases, shifting the curve left. And then there are shocks. Sudden events like wars, natural disasters, or OPEC cutting oil production. These reduce supply, shifting the curve left and pushing prices higher. You can see these effects all around us. Fuel prices often spike when global supply is cut. That's a supply curve shifting left. Or look at iPhones. Every time Apple releases a new model, demand skyrockets, pushing the demand curve to the right, which drives up prices until supply eventually catches up. So to wrap this up, remember the big picture. Demand comes from consumers. It usually moves opposite to price. Supply comes from producers. It usually moves in the same direction as price. Equilibrium is where they meet. Now that we've introduced demand, let's go a little deeper into one of the most important ideas in microeconomics: elasticity. At its core, elasticity measures how sensitive people are to changes, especially changes in price. It answers the question, if the price goes up or down, how much does quantity demanded respond? Formally, we call this price elasticity of demand. The definition is simple. Price elasticity of demand is the percentage change in quantity demanded divided by the percentage change in price. That's the formula, but let's make it real with examples. Think about gasoline. Even if gas prices rise by 20%, most people will still fill up their cars. Maybe they'll drive a little less, but they won't suddenly stop driving to work or school. That means demand for gas is inelastic, not very responsive to price changes. Now compare that with something like movie tickets. If ticket prices suddenly doubled from $10 to $20, many people would cut back. They might stream at home, or just skip going to the theater altogether. That means demand for movies is elastic, very responsive to price changes. Here's the simple rule. Necessities, like gas, electricity, or basic food, usually have inelastic demand. Luxuries or non-essentials, like movies, vacations, or designer clothes, usually have elastic demand. Why does this matter? For businesses, elasticity helps set smart pricing. If you know your product is inelastic, like medicine, you can raise prices without losing many customers. That's why life-saving drugs often stay profitable, even at high prices. But if your product is elastic, like fast food or clothing, raising prices too much could drive customers away. For governments, elasticity affects tax policy. If they place a tax on cigarettes or gasoline, people still buy them, so the government earns reliable revenue. But if they tax something highly elastic, like restaurant meals, people may just stop buying, and the tax won't bring in much money. Elasticity even shows up in our daily lives. Think about when your favorite coffee shop raises prices. If you need that morning coffee, you'll pay the extra 50 cents. But if it's just a weekend treat, you might skip it or look for a cheaper option. Without realizing it, you're showing whether your demand is elastic or inelastic. So here's the big takeaway. Elasticity tells us how much people react to price changes. Inelastic goods are things we must have, so price doesn't matter much. Elastic goods are optional, so price matters a lot. And once you understand this, you'll start seeing it everywhere. In business strategies, government policies, and even in your own spending choices. Imagine walking into your favorite pizza place on a Saturday afternoon. You're hungry, you buy a slice, and it feels amazing. That satisfaction you get from eating the pizza is what economists call utility. In simple words, utility is the satisfaction or pleasure we receive from consuming a good or service. Every time we buy or use something, whether it's a coffee, a new pair of shoes, or even streaming a new show on Netflix, we're chasing that feeling of satisfaction. Now, economists make a useful distinction between two kinds of utility: total utility and marginal utility. Think of total utility as the overall satisfaction you get from consuming a certain amount of something. If you eat 3 slices of pizza, your total utility is the total happiness from all 3 slices combined. But marginal utility is a little different. It's the extra satisfaction you get from consuming one more unit. So the first slice might feel like heaven. The second slice is still good but not as special, and by the 4th or 5th slice, you might even regret it. Let's look at a simple example. Suppose your satisfaction from pizza slices goes like this. The first slice gives you 20 units of happiness. The second slice brings you 15 more, so now you're at 35 total. The third slice adds 10 more, total of 45. The fourth slice adds only 5, so you're at 50. Notice what's happening? Each slice is still adding something, but the extra benefit is shrinking. This is the law of diminishing marginal utility. It says that as we consume more of the same good, the additional satisfaction we get from each extra unit decreases. The idea is everywhere in daily life. The first sip of coffee in the morning feels magical, but by your 3rd or 4th cup, the thrill is gone. Watching one episode of your favorite show is exciting. Binge watching 8 in a row leaves you less satisfied, and maybe even guilty. So how do consumers make choices if satisfaction declines with each extra unit? The answer lies in decision-making with constraints. None of us have unlimited money. We're constantly balancing what we want with what we can actually afford. Economists say consumers aim to maximize their satisfaction subject to their budget constraint. In other words, we're always asking, how do I get the most happiness for every dollar I spend? That's where the idea of bang for the buck comes in. Utility per dollar spent. Suppose a slice of pizza costs $2 and gives you 20 units of satisfaction, while a soda costs $1 and gives you 5 units of satisfaction. The pizza gives you 10 units of utility per dollar, while the soda gives you only 5. If you want to maximize happiness, you'd spend more of your budget on pizza until that balance evens out. This way of thinking explains a lot about consumer behavior. It tells us why sales and discounts can shift demand. Suddenly, the bang for the buck changes. It tells us why people diversify their consumption, buying some pizza, some soda, maybe even a dessert, because eventually the marginal utility of pizza falls enough that soda looks more attractive. At its core, consumer theory isn't about cold formulas. It's about the very human way we make choices in a world of limited resources. We want satisfaction, but we face trade-offs. Every purchase is a balancing act between desire, diminishing satisfaction, and budget. And the framework of utility gives us a window into that decision-making process, showing how rational consumers stretch their money to get the most out of life's little pleasures, whether it's food, coffee, or even those late-night Netflix binges. Imagine for a moment that instead of being a consumer, you're running a business. As a producer, your goal isn't to maximize satisfaction or utility like consumers do, but to maximize profit. Every decision you make about how much to produce, what to sell, and at what price revolves around this basic goal. Profit, of course, is simply the difference between revenue and costs. Revenue is straightforward. It's the price you charge multiplied by the quantity you sell. If you run a coffee shop and sell a muffin for $3 and you sell 100 muffins, that's $300 in revenue. Costs, on the other hand, are a little more nuanced. We divide them into fixed costs, which don't change with production, and variable costs, which do. The rent you pay for your shop is fixed. You owe it whether you sell a single muffin or 1,000. The flour, sugar, and labor that go into baking those muffins are variable. The more you produce, the higher those costs climb. So how does a producer decide the right level of output? The key lies in marginal cost, which is the cost of producing just one more unit. Think about that coffee shop again. Suppose you've baked 99 muffins and you're considering baking one more. If the cost of baking that extra muffin, say in terms of ingredients and labor, is $2, but you can sell it for $3, then it makes sense to produce it. You've added $1 of profit. But if the marginal cost rises to $4 while the price is still $3, producing that extra muffin would actually lose you money. The rational decision is to stop there. This logic is what gives us the upward sloping supply curve. When prices rise, producers are more willing to supply more because each additional unit is more likely to cover its marginal cost and yield profit. At low prices, production is limited because only the cheapest units to produce are worthwhile. But as prices climb, producers can justify expanding output, even if the additional units are more costly to make. So, producer theory boils down to this. Businesses weigh their revenues against their costs, both fixed and variable, and they pay special attention to marginal cost when deciding how far to produce. And when you step back, you see the bigger picture. It's these countless individual producer decisions, made daily in coffee shops, factories, and farms, that together shape the entire supply side of the market. When we walk into a market or a coffee shop, we usually don't stop to think about it, but every purchase creates a hidden benefit for both the buyer and the seller. Economists call these hidden benefits consumer surplus and producer surplus, and together they explain why markets are such powerful engines of value creation. Let's start with the perspective of the buyer. Imagine you really want a cup of coffee. In your mind, you'd be willing to pay as much as $5 because that's the value you personally place on it. But when you reach the counter, you see that the actual price is only $3. You get the coffee for $3, but you would have happily paid $5. That $2 difference is your extra benefit. Economists call it consumer surplus. It's simply the gap between what you were prepared to pay and what you actually had to pay. Now, if we zoom out and look at an entire market full of consumers, each person has their own willingness to pay. Some would pay a lot, some only a little, but everyone pays the same market price. When you plot this on a graph, with demand sloping downward, the area under the demand curve but above the actual market price forms a triangle. That shaded region represents the total consumer surplus, the hidden gain all buyers together enjoy by paying less than they were willing to. But the story doesn't end with consumers. Sellers also experience a surplus. Imagine a local baker making muffins. The minimum price she'd accept to cover her costs, ingredients, time, effort, might be $1.50 per muffin. But if the market price is $3, she earns an extra $1.50 on each one sold. That's her producer surplus. It's the difference between the price producers actually receive and the minimum they would have been willing to accept. When we put this on a supply and demand graph, the supply curve represents those minimum acceptable prices. The area above the supply curve but below the market price forms another triangle, and that's the total producer surplus, the hidden gain all sellers together receive. So here's the beauty of it. Every time a voluntary trade happens in a market, both sides walk away with a benefit. The buyer gains surplus because they paid less than what the item was worth to them. The seller gains surplus because they received more than their minimum acceptable price. No one is forced, everyone gains, and these surpluses measure just how much value the market is creating. Take the coffee shop example again. You, as a consumer, enjoyed a $2 surplus. The coffee shop owner may have only needed $2 to cover costs, but sold for $3 and earned a $1 surplus. Multiply that across dozens of customers and hundreds of cups, and the total surplus becomes a large measure of mutual benefit. Economists often add consumer surplus and producer surplus together to get something called total surplus, which is the overall net benefit society gets from market transactions. That's why markets are so celebrated. They don't just move money around, they create additional value that didn't exist before. So next time you buy a coffee, a book, or even a concert ticket, remember, there's a triangle of hidden value behind that simple exchange. You as the buyer walk away a little happier because you paid less than you were willing to, and the seller walks away a little happier because they earned more than they needed to. That's consumer and producer surplus in action, the quiet engine that makes markets beneficial for everyone involved. Imagine we've been talking about consumers and producers separately, but now let's bring them together. When consumers get a good deal, that's consumer surplus. When producers make more than their minimum acceptable price, that's producer surplus. Put the two together, and what we get is something called total surplus, which is just another way of saying total welfare, or the overall benefit society gains from a market. Now here's the really fascinating part. When a market is allowed to work freely, supply and demand naturally push toward equilibrium, and that equilibrium point is where total surplus is maximized. In other words, the market doesn't just find a middle ground between buyers and sellers by accident. It lands at the place where overall welfare is as large as it can possibly be. That's why economists love equilibrium. Let's make this more concrete with an example. Picture a local coffee market. On one side, we've got the demand curve, people who want coffee and the prices they're willing to pay. On the other side is the supply curve, coffee shops willing to sell cups at different prices. Where those two curves meet, that's the equilibrium price and quantity. At that exact point, the shaded area above the price line and under demand represents consumer surplus. That's buyers enjoying their coffee at a lower price than they were willing to pay. Below the price line and above supply sits producer surplus, the extra profit sellers make because they're getting more than their minimum acceptable price. When you add those two shaded areas together, you're looking at the total surplus created by the coffee market. And here's the kicker. Any price higher or lower than equilibrium actually reduces that total surplus. If the price is set too high, some consumers drop out because they can't afford it, and total surplus shrinks. If the price is set too low, some producers leave the market because it's not worth selling, and again, total surplus shrinks. That's why equilibrium is called efficient, not because it's perfect in every way, but because it maximizes the benefit for both sides combined. Buyers get as much happiness as possible, sellers get as much profit as possible, and together, the outcome is as good as it gets given the resources available. So the big takeaway is this. Consumer surplus and producer surplus are not just separate stories. They are chapters of the same bigger story. And equilibrium is the point where that story has the happiest ending for society as a whole. That's market efficiency in action. Now that we've introduced the basics of microeconomics, let's turn to something that lies at the very heart of every business: costs, revenues, and profit. Think of this as the heartbeat of an organization. If we can understand how money flows in and out, we can begin to see exactly when a business is truly making money and when it isn't. Let's begin with costs. Every business has two types: fixed and variable. Fixed costs are expenses that remain the same regardless of how much you produce. For example, imagine our coffee shop. Whether we sell a single cup of coffee or 1,000, the rent for the shop and the monthly internet bill don't change. Those are fixed costs. On the other hand, variable costs change with the level of production. The more coffee we sell, the more beans, milk, sugar, and cups we must buy. As sales increase, variable costs rise right alongside them. So in short, fixed costs remain constant no matter the output, while variable costs move directly with production. And every business has some combination of both. But costs are only one side of the story. To make smart decisions, we also need to consider marginal analysis, specifically marginal cost and marginal revenue. Marginal cost is simply the cost of producing one additional unit. If our coffee shop brews one more latte, the extra beans, milk, and labor required represent the marginal cost. Marginal revenue, on the other hand, is the additional income from selling that one more unit. If we sell that latte for $4, the marginal revenue is $4. Here's the golden rule. If marginal revenue is greater than marginal cost, it makes sense to keep producing, because each extra unit adds profit. But if marginal cost rises above marginal revenue, producing more actually reduces profit, and that's when it's time to stop. This principle applies everywhere, from small cafes to giant corporations. Now let's bring costs and revenues together with one of the most practical tools in business: the break-even point. Suppose our coffee shop has fixed costs of $1,000 per month, which covers rent and utilities. Each cup of coffee sells for $5, and the variable cost per cup, the beans, milk, sugar, and the cup itself, is $2. That means each sale contributes $3 toward covering fixed costs, because 5 minus 2 equals 3. To figure out how many cups we need to sell to break even, we simply divide fixed costs by contribution per unit. 1,000 divided by 3 is 300, roughly 334. In other words, once we sell about 334 cups, we've covered every cost. Cup number 335 and beyond is pure profit. That's why break-even analysis is so powerful. It gives businesses a clear survival target. Sell fewer units and you're losing money. Sell exactly that number and you're safe. Sell more and you're building profit. So let's step back and see the big picture. Fixed and variable costs show us what changes and what stays constant. Marginal cost and marginal revenue help us decide how much to produce. Break-even analysis reveals the exact point where survival turns into profit. And the best part is that these ideas apply to every kind of venture. Whether it's a coffee shop, a clothing brand, a factory, or even a YouTube creator investing in equipment, the same principles apply. Costs, revenues, and profits always tell the story of whether the business is sustainable. And that's the essence of this topic. Understanding costs, revenues, and profit gives us the building blocks of smart, informed business decisions. Now that we've covered how supply and demand work together in a market, let's take the next step and talk about the different types of market structures. Think of market structures as the rules of the game for businesses. They describe how many sellers are in the market, how much control they have over price, and how easy it is for new competitors to enter. Economists usually group markets into 4 main categories: perfect competition, monopoly, oligopoly, and monopolistic competition. We'll start with perfect competition, the simplest and most idealized form. In a perfectly competitive market, there are many small sellers offering identical products. No single seller can raise the price, because buyers will just switch to another seller offering the same thing. Prices are determined purely by supply and demand. A classic example is a farmer's market. Imagine dozens of farmers selling tomatoes. If one farmer tries to charge more, customers will simply buy from another farmer. Everyone sells at the same market price. Now, in reality, perfect competition is rare, but agriculture, basic commodities, and even financial markets like foreign exchange come closest to this structure. On the other extreme, we have a monopoly. A monopoly means there's only one seller in the entire market. That seller has total control over supply and price. Barriers to entry are very high, often due to government regulation, ownership of key resources, or the huge costs required to start. An example is utility companies, like electricity or water providers. It wouldn't make sense for multiple companies to build overlapping water pipelines, so one company controls the market. In monopolies, prices are higher and consumer choice is limited, which is why governments often step in with regulations to protect the public. Between those two extremes lies an oligopoly. This is when a few large firms dominate the market. Each company is big enough to influence price, and because there are only a handful of players, they pay very close attention to one another. Sometimes they even collude, meaning they secretly cooperate to keep prices high, though this is illegal in most countries. Examples include airlines, smartphone companies, or car manufacturers. Think of how Apple, Samsung, and Google dominate the smartphone industry. They don't sell identical products, but their pricing and innovation decisions directly affect each other. In oligopolies, competition often focuses on branding, features, and marketing, rather than purely on price. Finally, we have monopolistic competition, which is probably the most common market structure we see in everyday life. Here, there are many sellers, but each one tries to make its products slightly different. The key word is differentiation, through branding, style, quality, or customer service. Restaurants are a great example. Dozens of places may sell pizza, but each restaurant makes its pizza unique. A special recipe, better service, or maybe just a cooler vibe. Clothing brands are another case. A t-shirt is basically a t-shirt, but branding makes Nike, Zara, or H&M feel like completely different options. In monopolistic competition, businesses do have some control over price because of differentiation. But if they push prices too high, customers can easily switch to alternatives. So here's the summary. Perfect competition equals many sellers, identical goods, no control over price. Monopoly equals one seller, total control, high barriers to entry. Oligopoly equals a few powerful firms, interdependent strategies. Monopolistic competition equals many sellers, but with differentiated products. Why does this matter? Because market structures explain why prices look the way they do, why some industries are highly competitive while others feel locked down, and how businesses make their strategic decisions. From the tomato farmer to Apple, from your local pizza shop to your electricity provider, market structures shape not only how businesses operate, but also the choices you face as a consumer every single day.
Markets are powerful systems. They bring buyers and sellers together, relying on supply and demand to decide what gets produced, how much, and at what price. In many cases, this process works beautifully, creating efficiency and innovation. But sometimes, markets stumble. They produce too much of something harmful, or too little of something beneficial. Economists call this market failure, and it simply means that when left on their own, markets don't always allocate resources in the best way for society. Think of a factory that produces affordable clothing. On the surface, this looks efficient. Customers get cheap products, the company earns revenue. But if that factory is also releasing harmful smoke into the air, there's a hidden cost that isn't captured in the price tag. Society bears that cost in the form of polluted air, higher healthcare expenses, and environmental damage. That's a textbook case of market failure. So, what types of market failures actually exist? Let's walk through the most important ones and how governments try to fix them. One major source of market failure comes from externalities. An externality is simply a side effect of an economic activity that impacts people who aren't directly part of the transaction. These can be negative or positive. Negative externalities occur when production or consumption harms others. Take pollution, secondhand smoke, or loud construction noise. In each case, the producer or consumer isn't paying for the full cost. Neighbors or society are. This leads to overproduction of these goods because the market price is artificially too low compared to the real cost. Imagine a supply curve that only considers private costs. The true social cost curve is higher, meaning the market outcome produces too much pollution compared to what's socially optimal. On the other hand, we also see positive externalities. These are activities that create extra benefits for society, but those benefits aren't fully reflected in the market. Education is a great example. When you get a degree, you benefit personally through higher income, but society also benefits from more skilled workers, higher productivity, and even reduced crime rates. Vaccinations are another example. One person's shot reduces the risk of spreading disease to many others. But because the extra benefits are not fully captured by individuals, markets tend to underproduce these goods. The social benefit curve lies above the private demand curve, leaving society with too little of them. This is where government steps in. To reduce negative externalities, governments can impose taxes, often called Pigouvian taxes, that reflect the true cost. A carbon tax is a common example. It makes producers internalize the cost of emissions. To encourage positive externalities, governments might offer subsidies, grants, or awareness campaigns. Scholarships, for instance, make education more affordable and push society closer to the optimal level. In both cases, intervention shifts the outcome toward what benefits everyone. Another big category of market failure is public goods. These are goods that are both non-rival and non-excludable. Non-rival means that one person's use doesn't reduce the amount available for others. If a streetlight is on, you and your neighbors can all enjoy it without running out.
Non-excludable means you can't easily stop people from using it. You can't realistically prevent someone from walking under a lit street or benefiting from national defense. The problem with public goods is the free rider problem. Because people can enjoy them without paying, private companies have little incentive to produce them. Imagine asking citizens to voluntarily fund a missile defense system. Some might pay, but many would prefer to free ride, knowing they'll be protected regardless. That's why governments usually step in directly, financing public goods through taxation and ensuring everyone benefits equally. Now, let's bring this back to taxation and intervention in general. Governments don't just use taxes to raise money. They also use them to correct failures. A Pigouvian tax makes polluters pay for the harm they cause, aligning private costs with social costs. On the flip side, subsidies can encourage more of the goods with positive spillovers, like renewable energy or medical research. By carefully shifting supply and demand, governments aim to guide markets closer to the socially optimal output. So what does this all mean in the bigger picture? Market failures remind us that free markets alone don't always maximize welfare. Sometimes, the invisible hand needs a helping hand. Governments step in to correct the imbalances, through taxes and subsidies, through direct provision of public goods, and through regulations that limit harmful activity. Think again of our factory example. Without intervention, it keeps polluting because pollution is cheap. With a carbon tax, suddenly the cost of polluting rises, and the company has an incentive to reduce emissions or invest in cleaner technology. Society ends up with cleaner air and better long-term health. That's the power of targeted government intervention. To wrap this up, remember the key insights. Market failure happens when the market outcome doesn't maximize social welfare. Externalities push production away from the social optimum. Public goods go underprovided due to the free rider problem, and taxes or subsidies can realign incentives. In short, markets are powerful, but they're not perfect. And that's why we study not only how markets work, but also when and how governments need to step in. Now that we've seen how markets can fail and how governments respond, we're ready to move on to the next step in our course, where we'll explore how these same principles apply to broader economic systems and decision-making. Stay tuned, because this is where theory starts to meet real-world policy debates. Let's begin with one of the most important measures in economics, GDP, or Gross Domestic Product. GDP is simply the total market value of all final goods and services produced within a country during a specific period of time. Think of it as the economy's report card. It tells us how much value a nation is creating through its businesses, workers, and industries. Why does it matter? Because GDP is one of the clearest signals of a country's economic health and standard of living. When GDP is growing steadily, businesses are producing more, people are earning more, and living standards generally rise. When GDP slows down, it often signals problems. Maybe businesses are struggling, unemployment is rising, or consumer spending is falling. Now, GDP isn't always measured the same way. Economists distinguish between nominal GDP and real GDP. Nominal GDP is measured at current prices. That means it reflects today's market prices, but it can be misleading when inflation is high. For example, if prices go up but the actual production of goods doesn't change, nominal GDP will rise, even though the economy isn't producing more. Real GDP, on the other hand, adjusts for inflation. It asks, how much did the economy really grow in terms of actual output, not just higher prices? That makes real GDP a better tool for comparing growth across years or countries. Let's use a simple example. Imagine a small pizza shop. If it sells $10,000 worth of pizzas in a year, that $10,000 contributes to the country's GDP. Now imagine millions of pizza shops, coffee shops, car makers, farmers, and software companies all reporting their revenues. When you add all of that together, you get the GDP of an entire country. Here's another way to see it. GDP is like a giant scoreboard for the economy. Every product sold, every service delivered, from a haircut to a smartphone, gets counted, but only if it's a final good. That means we don't double count raw materials or components. For instance, the cheese sold to the pizza shop doesn't count separately because it's already included in the final pizza's value. So to recap, GDP tells us how much value a country is creating. It can be measured in nominal terms or real terms, and it helps us understand the overall direction of the economy.
Let's talk about two of the most important issues in economics: inflation and unemployment. These are like the vital signs of an economy, just like heart rate and blood pressure are for a human being. If they get out of balance, the whole system feels it. So what exactly is inflation? Simply put, inflation is the general rise in the overall price level of goods and services over time. In other words, when the same basket of groceries or the same cup of coffee costs more this year than it did last year, that's inflation. But why does inflation happen? Economists usually point to two main causes. First, demand pull inflation. This happens when demand grows faster than supply. Imagine a popular new smartphone release. Everyone wants it, but supply is limited, so prices shoot up. That's demand pulling prices higher. Second, cost push inflation. This comes from the supply side. If the cost of raw materials, like oil or wheat, suddenly rises, businesses pass those higher costs on to consumers in the form of higher prices. Now, some inflation is normal and even healthy. It signals a growing economy. But too much inflation is dangerous. It eats away at people's purchasing power, creates uncertainty for businesses, and if it spins out of control, it can lead to hyperinflation. A classic example? Zimbabwe in the 2000s, where prices doubled almost daily, and people needed wheelbarrows of cash just to buy bread. Now, let's shift to unemployment. Unemployment simply means people who are willing and able to work but cannot find a job. But it's not just one single type. Economists classify it into categories. The first one is frictional unemployment. This is the natural, short-term unemployment that happens when people are between jobs. For example, a college graduate who just left one job and is searching for another. The second one is structural unemployment. This occurs when workers' skills don't match the jobs available. Think about how automation has reduced factory jobs but increased demand for coding and tech skills. If workers can't transition, they face structural unemployment. The third one is cyclical unemployment. This is linked directly to the ups and downs of the business cycle. During recessions, businesses cut back, jobs are lost, and cyclical unemployment rises. We've seen this in history. During the 2008 financial crisis, millions lost jobs as businesses collapsed, a textbook case of cyclical unemployment. More recently, after COVID-19, many industries like hospitality and travel shrank, while tech and remote jobs grew. That created structural unemployment because workers in shrinking industries couldn't instantly move into the new ones. So why do economists focus so much on inflation and unemployment? Because they're deeply connected. If inflation runs high, central banks often raise interest rates, which slows spending and can increase unemployment. On the other hand, if unemployment is too high, governments may stimulate the economy, which can push inflation higher. It's a constant balancing act. Too much of either problem, and the economy struggles. Here's the key takeaway. Inflation reduces the value of money, while unemployment wastes human potential. Together, they shape the everyday reality of families, businesses, and governments. Understanding them isn't just theory. It's about understanding the real forces that affect our lives every single day. Up until now, we've been talking about how economies grow, shrink, and face challenges like inflation and unemployment. But here's the big question. Who's steering the ship? Who makes the decisions that can stabilize or shake an economy? That's where government and monetary policy come in. Let's start with monetary policy. Every country has a central bank. In the US, it's the Federal Reserve. But globally, you'll hear names like the European Central Bank, the Bank of England, or the Reserve Bank of India. Their main job? Control the money supply and interest rates. Think of interest rates as the price of borrowing money. If the central bank lowers interest rates,
it suddenly becomes cheaper for businesses to take loans, hire more workers, or expand. Consumers are encouraged to borrow too, maybe buy a house or finance a car. This stimulates growth, but if prices are rising too fast, inflation, the bank does the opposite. It raises interest rates. That makes borrowing more expensive, slows down spending, and cools inflation. In short, monetary policy is like adjusting the speed of the economy, pressing the accelerator or tapping the brakes. Now let's bring in the government side, fiscal policy. This is all about taxes and spending. If the government cuts taxes, people and businesses keep more money in their pockets, which can boost spending. If the government increases spending, say building highways, funding schools, or even sending out direct payments, that injects cash straight into the economy. One clear example, stimulus checks during COVID. Governments gave households money directly to help them get through lockdowns and job losses. That's fiscal policy in action.
The pandemic gave us a textbook case of how monetary and fiscal policies work together. Central banks slashed interest rates and pumped more money into the financial system. That's monetary policy. Governments rolled out massive relief programs, stimulus checks, unemployment benefits, business loans. That's fiscal policy. Together, these policies helped economies recover faster. But there was a trade-off. The flood of money contributed to the inflation spike of 2021 to 2022. So you can see, policy choices aren't just numbers in a textbook. They show up in your daily life, in job availability, loan costs, even the price of groceries. If you remember just one thing, let it be this. GDP tells us the size of the economy. Inflation and unemployment show us the health of the economy. Policies, both monetary and fiscal, are the tools used to manage that health. Macroeconomics is not abstract. It connects to every job, every price, every paycheck. And understanding how governments and central banks make these choices helps you understand the world around you. Now that we've explored how economics works within a single country, let's zoom out and look at the bigger picture, the global economy. The truth is, no country can produce everything it needs efficiently. That's why trade exists. Trade allows countries to specialize in what they do best, and then exchange with others for the rest. In simple terms, trade makes the economic pie bigger for everyone. One of the most powerful ideas here is comparative advantage. This is the principle that even if one country is better at producing everything, it still benefits from trading with others. What matters is relative efficiency. For example, Kenya has the right climate and soil to grow coffee at a low cost. The United States, on the other hand, has advanced technology and capital to produce software and airplanes more efficiently. If each focuses on its strength, Kenya on coffee, the US on tech, and then they trade, both sides end up better off. That's comparative advantage in action. Now, let's connect this to our world today. We live in an age of globalization, where economies are tightly linked through trade, investment, technology, and supply chains. A smartphone you buy in London or New York might be designed in California, use chips made in Taiwan, be assembled in China, and shipped across the world. No single country could create that product alone. But globalization also brings challenges. When supply chains are disrupted, say by a pandemic, a war, or rising energy costs, the ripple effects are felt everywhere. A shipping delay in one country can raise prices worldwide. We've seen this with fuel prices, food shortages, and even with microchips for cars and electronics. Energy is another global issue. Countries that import oil and gas depend on exporters to keep their economies running. Shifts in energy prices affect inflation, living costs, and even political stability. So the big picture is this. Trade and globalization connect the world in ways that create huge benefits, but also shared vulnerabilities. Understanding global economics helps us see not just why our morning coffee is affordable, but also why events on the other side of the planet can impact our wallets tomorrow. That's global economics. Countries specialize, they trade, they connect through globalization, and together they face both opportunities
and challenges. We've covered a lot together, so let's take a step back and put it all into perspective. At its core, economics is about choices. We live in a world of scarcity, limited time, limited money, limited resources. And because we can't have everything, we make choices. Those choices are shaped by incentives, the rewards and costs that influence what people and businesses decide to do. And when you add it all up, those choices interact within different economic systems, like capitalism, socialism, or mixed economies, that shape how entire societies function. So to recap in one line, economics deals with choices, scarcity, incentives, and systems. Now here's the cool part. This isn't just theory you'll leave in the classroom. You're already using economics in your everyday life, whether you realize it or not. Think about budgeting. If you've ever had to decide between saving for something big or spending on something fun right now, that's economics at work, weighing opportunity costs. Or your career choices. Maybe you're comparing two jobs. One pays more but requires longer hours. The other gives you more free time but less money. Again, that's economics, balancing trade-offs. Even in politics and news, economics is everywhere. When you hear debates about taxes, minimum wage, inflation, unemployment, those are economic questions. If you understand the basics of scarcity, incentives, and trade-offs, you can cut through the noise and actually see what's going on. And here's something motivating. If you've understood this intro, you've just built the foundation for every business, finance, and management course ahead of you. Accounting, marketing, strategy, investments, even entrepreneurship, all of them sit on top of these core economic ideas. So the takeaway is simple. Economics is not just a subject, it's a mindset. Once you start thinking like an economist, you'll see the world differently. Every decision, from what you eat for lunch to how countries trade with each other, suddenly makes more sense. Congratulations, you didn't just learn economics, you learned how to think about the world in a smarter, sharper way. And this is only the beginning.